think I'm starting to lose my mind." The call came unexpectedly. A neighbor from the village, her voice hushed with unease, explained that my grandmother had been acting strangely. She would sit for hours motionless, her gaze unfocused, whispering to herself in a language no one recognized. She had begun avoiding people, refusing to answer the door, refusing to eat. Something was deeply wrong. I took the next train, arriving at dusk. The village was quiet, its narrow streets nearly deserted. My grandmother's house stood on the edge of the woods, small and dark, its windows staring blankly like empty sockets. The air felt thick, the silence pressing in too tightly. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the house smelled of dust, aged wood, and something else. Something faintly metallic like rust or dried blood. The furniture remained as I remembered it, though the space felt hollow, as if something vital had been drained from it. I found her in the living room, seated in her rocking chair by the fireplace. She wasn't moving, but her lips were. A soft, wet whispering sound filled the air, too low to decipher, too rhythmic to be meaningless. Her face was pale, skin stretched thin over sharp cheekbones. Her hands rested limply on her lap, fingers twitching slightly. Her body was stiff, but there was an unsettling tension in the way she sat, like something coiled, waiting. She didn't react to my presence. Even when I stepped closer, even when I placed a hand on her frail shoulder, she remained lost in that whispering trance. But then, without warning, the whispering stopped. Her head turned. Her eyes, once familiar, warm, were wrong. Darker than I remembered. Wider, as if something else was staring through them. And then, she smiled. The expression stretched too far, her lips peeling back over too many teeth. It was not a smile of recognition, nor of comfort. It was something else entirely. A single candle flickered beside her, though the air was still. It wavered violently, casting shadows that slithered across the walls like living things. Then, suddenly, she slumped forward, her body deflating as if the energy holding her together had been drained. For a long moment, she was silent, utterly still. And then the whispering returned. Softer this time, almost inaudible. Something about the cadence of the words made my stomach tighten, a primal fear stirring deep inside me. The candle went out. The darkness that followed was absolute. The darkness in the room felt different, thicker, heavier than it should have been. The air held a strange weight, as if something unseen had settled into the space beside me. For a long moment, the only sound was my own breathing, too loud in the suffocating silence. Then, beneath it, something else, soft, wet whispering. My grandmother's voice, still murmuring those strange, guttural words. I reached for the matches on the table, my fingers shaking as I struck one against the box. The tiny flame flared to life, casting flickering light over the room. My grandmother hadn't moved. Her head remained bowed, her body limp, but her lips were still forming those unholy syllables. The sound made my skin crawl. The candle's wick caught fire, filling the room with a weak, shivering glow. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do, the unease in my stomach growing into something close to fear. Something was deeply wrong with her. The neighbor hadn't exaggerated. If anything, they hadn't told me the worst of it. I needed to get her out of this house. Gently, I touched her shoulder. Her skin was ice cold. She didn't react at first, but then, slowly, her head tilted up. Her eyes, dark and distant, fixed on me with an unsettling, hollow stare. I helped her to her feet. She moved with eerie stiffness, like her limbs no longer belonged to her. As I guided her toward the door, the whispering stopped. I felt a shift in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. The feeling didn't leave me, even after I got her into the car. The road back to the city stretched empty before me, swallowed in the night's darkness. My grandmother sat silent in the passenger seat, her gaze locked on the window, though there was nothing to see but endless black. She didn't speak the entire drive, not until we reached my apartment. Then, just as I stepped inside and closed the door, I heard it again. The whispering. Only this time it wasn't coming from her. It was coming from inside my home. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. A wet, rhythmic whispering that seeped into the quiet of my apartment like something alive. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, curling through the air like a breath against the back of my neck. I froze in the doorway. My grandmother stood beside me, unmoving, her head tilted slightly as if she, too, was listening. The apartment was exactly as I had left it, dimly lit, neat, undisturbed. And yet, something felt off. A shift in the air, a presence just beyond the edges of perception. I swallowed hard and guided my grandmother to the couch, my hands unsteady. She sat without protest, her body sinking into the cushions as if she had no weight of her own. Her eyes remained distant, locked on the far wall, her lips slightly parted. The whispering had stopped. For a moment, the silence felt almost worse. I moved through the apartment, checking every room, every shadowed corner, trying to find a source for the noise. Nothing, just the same empty spaces I had always known. But as I returned to the living room, I hesitated. The candle on the table, I was certain I hadn't lit one. And yet, its flame flickered weakly, casting long, shivering shadows across the walls. I hadn't lit it. A chill crept up my spine. My grandmother shifted slightly, her fingers twitching against the fabric of the couch. Her breathing was slow, deliberate, like someone in deep concentration. I stepped closer, hesitant, and only then did I notice her lips moving again. She was whispering. The words were barely audible, but the cadence was the same as before, low, guttural, something wrong. It didn't sound like a language. It sounded like something older than language. Her breath came in slow, ragged pulls, her chest rising and falling as if she were struggling to keep control of something inside her. And then she stopped. Her head snapped toward me with unsettling sharpness. Her mouth was slightly open, her teeth barely visible between her lips. The candle's flame wavered. The shadows on the wall moved. And then, for the first time since bringing her here, she made a sound that wasn't a whisper. A soft, choking laugh. I took a step back. My pulse pounded in my ears. The candle went out. Darkness swallowed the room. And in that darkness, I heard a voice that wasn't hers. It spoke in a language I didn't understand. And it was right behind me. The voice was right behind me. A low, wet murmur, just inches from my ear. I couldn't understand the words, but I felt them, each syllable crawling beneath my skin like a living thing. I turned, fast, my breath caught in my throat. Nothing. The apartment was still cloaked in darkness. The air felt heavier now, thick with something unseen. My grandmother sat motionless on the couch, her head tilted slightly, her unblinking eyes reflecting the faint sliver of moonlight from the window. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers shaking as I switched on the flashlight. The weak beam of light cut through the dark, illuminating the walls, the furniture, the empty spaces that should have been empty. But the whispering hadn't stopped. It was coming from the farthest corner of the room. I swung the light toward it. The beam landed on the blank wall, smooth and featureless. But as the light trembled in my hands, I saw something shift in the darkness. A flicker of movement just beyond the edges of perception. A shape, tall, unmoving, and then slowly it stepped forward. The air turned ice cold. My breath hitched in my chest. There was nothing there, no body, no face, just the vague distortion of space itself, like the air had been warped around something unseen. But I could feel it watching me. My grandmother's breathing changed. A slow inhale, a rasping exhale. Her lips parted slightly, and a single whisper slithered from her mouth, so soft I almost missed it. They found me. The lights snapped back on. The thing was gone. The candle on the table was burning again, though I hadn't touched it. The air was still thick, charged with something I couldn't explain. My grandmother remained on the couch, her expression unchanged, but her fingers twitched against her lap. I backed away, my pulse hammering. Something was in my apartment. Something had followed her here, and it wasn't leaving. The air in my apartment never settled after that night. Even with the lights on, even in broad daylight, something lingered. a presence just beneath the surface of reality, hiding in the corners, waiting in the silence. My grandmother remained the same, silent, distant, trapped in whatever twilight state had claimed her. She barely moved, barely ate. She spent most of her time sitting by the window, staring at nothing, her lips sometimes moving in quiet, rhythmic whispers. I tried to ignore it. I convinced myself I was imagining things. Stress, exhaustion, the mind playing tricks. But I couldn't ignore the feeling. I started waking up in the middle of the night with the distinct sensation of being watched. The air in my room would feel thick, pressing, like something unseen was standing just outside my field of vision. Once, I woke up gasping for breath, my body cold with sweat. The room was dark, except for the faint sliver of light coming from the hallway. The door was slightly open, though I knew I had closed it before going to bed. For a long moment I stayed still, listening. Nothing. But then, from the living room, I heard it. A soft, deliberate shuffle. A dragging sound, like something shifting across the floor. I forced myself to move, to sit up. The air was suffocatingly still. I reached for my phone, turning on the flashlight. Its weak glow barely cut through the darkness as I swung my legs over the side of the bed. My heart pounded as I stepped into the hallway, the wooden floorboards cold beneath my feet. The living room was dim, illuminated only by the glow of the streetlights outside. My grandmother sat exactly where I had left her, in the chair by the window. Her body was still, but her lips moved in that same silent whisper. And then I saw it, the floor beside her, dust disturbed, a faint trail leading from the couch to the farthest corner of the room, like something had crawled across it. I checked the door, still locked, the windows, closed. There was no way anything had gotten inside. And yet, the marks were there. The whispering from my grandmother stopped. The candle on the table flickered, though there was no wind. And in the quiet that followed, I realized something that made my blood run cold. There was no reflection in the window. Not of me, not of her, nothing at all. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The window pane should have reflected something. The glow of the streetlights, the faint outline of furniture, my own shadow standing in the doorway. But there was nothing, just an expanse of pure, depthless black, like a hole in reality. My grandmother sat motionless in her chair, facing that empty void. Her body was limp, but her lips twitched as if she were on the verge of speaking. I took a slow step closer, my legs heavy with dread. Then movement, not in the room, not anywhere visible. Something stirred inside the glass. It was subtle at first, barely a ripple in the darkness, but then a shape began to emerge. A hand, thin, two long fingers pressing against the other side of the window as if feeling for a way through. My grandmother exhaled, slow and deep, her breath fogging the surface. And for the briefest moment, something looked back at me from within that darkness. Not my reflection, not hers, something else. I stumbled back, my hand knocking against the table. The candle wavered violently. The moment my gaze broke from the window, a soft, wet whisper curled through the room. Not from my grandmother, from the reflection. The words were low, guttural, vibrating through my skull like something spoken inside my head. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shape in the glass receded. The darkness shifted, pulling back, and our reflections snapped into place as if nothing had happened. My own face stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed. My grandmother's too, her expression hollow. But her lips were no longer moving. She was staring straight ahead, unblinking, her hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Her breathing had changed, shallow and ragged, like she was trying to hold something in. The candle beside her flared up, its flame unnaturally high for a split second before settling. The air in the apartment felt heavier now, as if the walls were pressing inward. I didn't sleep that night, and when I checked on my grandmother in the early hours of the morning, I found her standing by the window, motionless, watching, waiting. I barely slept anymore. Every night, the air in the apartment felt heavier. The shadows stretched longer, as if something unseen was pressing in from the edges of reality. My grandmother never spoke, never acknowledged me, but I would wake up in the middle of the night to find her standing by the window, her face inches from the glass, staring into the blackness beyond. And then the scratching started. It began just after midnight, a faint, deliberate scraping against my front door. Not frantic, not hurried, just a slow, measured drag of nails against wood. At first, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was the building settling or a trick of my overtired mind. But each night it grew worse. The sound would begin softly, then escalate, the pressure increasing as if something was testing the door. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I crept to the entrance, my heart hammering, my breath shallow. The scratching had stopped the moment I moved. I hesitated, fingers hovering over the handle, then pressed my eye against the peephole. The hallway outside was empty. No sound, no movement. But the moment I stepped back, a loud, violent scrape tore through the silence, deep and raw, as if something with sharp claws had raked across the wood. I staggered back, pulse pounding in my ears. The door shuddered slightly, not from force, but as if something was leaning against it from the other side. The doorknob twitched, then a whisper, muffled, distorted. It came from the other side of the door, impossibly low, the words slithering through the cracks. A language I didn't understand. My stomach turned to ice. Behind me, a floorboard creaked. I turned sharply. My grandmother was standing in the darkened hallway, facing me. I hadn't heard her move. She had been sitting in the living room just moments ago, but now she was here, inches away. Her lips moved soundlessly, as if she were whispering to herself. Her eyes, wide and glassy, locked onto the door behind me. And then, something answered from the other side. A guttural, rasping exhale. The doorknob twisted once, sharply, then stopped. The apartment fell silent. My grandmother exhaled shakily, the first real sign of emotion I had seen from her in days. She turned without a word and walked back to the living room, her movements unnervingly stiff. I stood there for what felt like an eternity before daring to press my palm against the door. The wood was ice cold. I didn't open it, and that night, as I lay awake in bed, I heard the whispering again. Only this time it was coming from inside the apartment. I didn't move. I lay in bed, my breathing shallow, ears straining against the suffocating silence of the apartment. The whispering was coming from somewhere in the dark. Low, rhythmic, writhing through the air like a living thing. It wasn't my grandmother. Her room was down the hall, and I could hear her faint, ragged breathing. This whispering, it was closer, much closer. Slowly, I turned my head toward the bedroom door. The hallway beyond was shrouded in darkness, but something about it felt wrong. The space itself seemed distorted, stretched into something deeper than it should have been. And then, ever so faintly, the whispering moved. Not footsteps, not shuffling, just a shift in the air, the kind you feel when someone steps behind you, when something unseen is too close. I reached for my phone, desperate for light. My fingers fumbled against the screen, but before I could turn it on, the whispering stopped. Silence. Then tap. A sound so soft, so deliberate, it took my brain a moment to register what it was. Fingertips, tapping against my bedroom door. Not knocking, just pressing, dragging, feeling along the wood as if searching for a way inside. My pulse pounded in my ears. I stayed perfectly still. The tapping continued, slow and patient, never frantic. Then came something worse. The doorknob twitched. Not a full turn. Not an attempt to open it. Just the faintest testing motion. A reminder that something was out there, and it knew I was awake. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the sheets so tightly my knuckles ached. My breath hitched as the tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a new sound, shifting fabric. A slow, scraping noise, like something dragging itself down the hallway. It was moving away. I forced myself to breathe, counting the seconds in my head. Then, from the living room, I heard my grandmother's chair creak. I swallowed hard. The whispering had stopped. The tapping was gone. but the feeling remained, that unbearable, suffocating sense of being watched. I turned my phone screen on, flooding the room with weak, artificial light. Nothing, but I didn't sleep again. And just before dawn, as the first hint of morning bled through the blinds, I heard my grandmother's voice for the first time in days. A single, hoarse whisper. "They are inside." Dawn brought no comfort. The weak, gray light filtered through the blinds, casting pale streaks across the floor, but the air in the apartment remained thick, tainted with something unseen, something wrong. My grandmother hadn't moved from her chair. Her body sagged as if all the life had drained from her, but her lips were slightly parted, her breath slow and deliberate. Her whisper from earlier still echoed in my mind. "They are inside." I didn't ask what she meant. I already knew. Something had entered this apartment with us. No, that wasn't right. Something had followed us here. I could feel it in every shadow, in every stretch of silence that lasted just a little too long. It was watching, waiting. I moved carefully through the apartment, my skin crawling with the sensation of unseen eyes. Every instinct told me to leave, to get my grandmother and run. But I knew somehow that it wouldn't matter. Wherever we went, they would follow. And then I saw it. A mark on the floor. Thin, dark, almost unnoticeable against the wooden boards. A perfect circle drawn in something that looked too deep to be ink. It hadn't been there before. My stomach twisted. I crouched down, hesitant, my fingers hovering just above it. The air above the mark felt cold. Not the normal chill of a draft, but something unnatural. The moment my fingertips brushed the surface, a violent shiver ran through my body, like something had reached inside my skin. A whisper, right behind me. I spun, heart hammering, nothing. Just the empty room, the faint swaying of the curtains in the morning light. But when I turned back to the floor, the mark was gone. Vanished, as if it had never been there. A slow creak echoed from the living room. My grandmother was no longer in her chair. She was standing by the window again, her bony fingers pressed against the glass. And this time she wasn't whispering. She was smiling, not at her reflection. Something else. Something outside. Something I couldn't see. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what had caught my grandmother's attention, what had drawn that unnatural, twisted smile across her face. But I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned toward the window. First, there was nothing. Just the pale, colorless light of morning bleeding through the glass, the quiet street below, the bare branches of the tree that stood near the curb. No figures, no movement. But the longer I stared, the more I realized something was off. The reflection. The room behind me was faintly visible in the window's glass. The chair, the candle, the far wall. My own blurred shape. But my grandmother wasn't in it. She was standing right in front of me, right at the window. But she wasn't there in the reflection. I stepped back, my stomach lurching, my breath coming too fast. My grandmother's thin shoulders twitched, and without turning her head, she exhaled in a slow, shuddering breath. And then the reflection changed. Not gradually, not subtly. In an instant, the glass no longer reflected my apartment at all. Instead, the window showed a different room, something vast and empty, bathed in a sickly, dim light. The floor was warped, the walls stretched impossibly high, disappearing into shadows. And something was standing there, a shape, tall, thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It had no features, no eyes, no mouth, just an empty, shifting void where its face should have been. It saw me. I couldn't explain how I knew, but I felt its attention settle on me, pressing against my mind like a weight. A sound filled the air. Not from my grandmother, not from the window, but from inside me. A slow, wet whisper unraveling in my head, crawling beneath my skin. I stumbled backward. The candle on the table flared violently, the flame stretching high before it snapped out, plunging the room into dim shadow. And then the window shattered. The glass exploded inward, shards raining across the floor. A freezing gust of air slammed into me, sharp and metallic with the scent of something ancient. And my grandmother, she was gone. No body, No trace, just the wind howling through the broken window, and the deep, shuddering breath of something else in the room with me. The room was silent, not the kind of silence that comes with emptiness, but a suffocating, unnatural stillness, as if the air itself was waiting for something to move. The broken window yawned open, but no wind entered. No sound from the street below, just the thin, metallic scent of something old lingering in the air. My grandmother was gone. The glass shards littered the floor, but there was no blood, no sign that she had fallen, just vanished, as if something had reached through the shattered reflection and taken her. A sharp, wet breath filled the room. Not mine. It came from the far corner, just beyond the edge of my vision. Slowly, I turned. The shadows in the corner seemed wrong, darker than they should have been, as if the space itself had deepened into something else. And then, within that blackness, something moved. A figure. Thin, impossibly tall. Its body folded into the darkness. Limbs too long, joints bending the wrong way. It didn't step forward. It didn't lunge. It unfolded. The moment its featureless face turned toward me, a pressure filled my skull. An overwhelming, smothering sensation, like my thoughts weren't my own anymore. A whisper curled through the air, soft and wet, spilling from the corners of the room, from inside the walls, from inside me. I staggered back, my head swimming. The whispering grew louder, the words foreign and thick, slipping through my brain like fingers in raw meat. And then I understood them. "We are here." A sudden, violent scraping filled the room. The floorboards shuddered beneath my feet, a slow, dragging sound echoing through the apartment. Not one voice now, many. I turned toward the hallway. The walls bulged outward, shifting, breathing. Shadows slithered along the floor, stretching toward me like fingers. The whispers turned into a single, rasping exhale. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. I stumbled through the apartment, my body sluggish, heavy, as if the air itself was pressing down on me. The front door loomed ahead, impossibly far, the wood warped and darkened with something wrong. Behind me, the walls groaned. Something was coming. I reached the door, my fingers grasping for the lock. The moment my skin touched the metal, a cold shock shot through my arm, something wrapping around my wrist. And then, right beside my ear, a whisper. "You brought us home." The lights flickered, and everything went black. The darkness swallowed everything. Couldn't see. Couldn't move. The air was thick, pressing, like the weight of unseen hands forcing me down, holding me in place. My breath came in ragged gasps, but the silence around me was absolute, until the whispering returned. It came from everywhere and nowhere, slithering through the void like a living thing. The words curled inside my head, stretching, pulling, changing. "You brought us home." A sudden pressure filled my chest. Something cold, something wrong inside me, spreading through my veins like ice. My fingers twitched, my legs convulsed. I wasn't standing anymore. I was somewhere else. A room, vast and empty. The walls stretched into blackness, shifting and breathing like something alive. The floor beneath me was wet, sticky and pulsing, as if I were standing on raw muscle. My grandmother was here, but she wasn't my grandmother anymore. She stood motionless in the center of the room, her body rigid, her head tilted upward. Her eyes, once dim and distant, were wide open now, staring at something above, something I couldn't see. I wanted to call out to her, to grab her, to run, but I couldn't move. The whispering grew louder. Shapes emerged from the dark, peeling away from the walls, shifting and unfolding like something old remembering how to be human. Their bodies were too long, their heads tilting at unnatural angles, their featureless faces turned toward me. They weren't walking, they were gliding. My grandmother's lips parted. A sound spilled from her throat. Not a whisper, not a breath, but a deep, guttural clicking, like bones snapping underwater. She lifted one frail hand, pointing towards something behind me. I didn't want to turn, couldn't turn, but my body moved on its own. A door stood there. It hadn't been there before, but it had always been there. Tall, wooden, warped, Something ancient, something that should never be opened. But the whispering demanded it. Go! My grandmother's face contorted, her mouth stretching too wide, her jaw unhinging with a sickening crack. The figures surrounding her loomed closer, their limbs twitching, their bodies trembling with anticipation. The door pulsed. The whispering became a chant. Go, go, go. I stepped forward. My fingers touched the handle. The door swung open, and everything collapsed. I woke up in my apartment, alone. The window was intact. The candle on the table flickered weakly, as if it had never gone out. But the air was still heavy, still wrong. My grandmother was gone. No trace of her remained. No sign that she had ever been here at all. And yet, when I stepped toward the hallway, my stomach turned to ice. Because the door at the end of the hall, the door to my bedroom, was slightly open, and from the darkness beyond, I heard it. A whisper, soft, wet. We never left.